world.
Uneducated girls are more vulnerable to sexual violence and exploitation, and they are also more likely to be forced into marriage before the onset of adulthood.
The 21st century still battles against child marriage, prevalent in the developing world. And Australia introduces a new gender for passport holders.
Male or female, or for those that want to identify as neither, they can now apply for a passport as indeterminate gender, X.
We'll also take a look at growing social unrest felt around the globe as fears of a lack of jobs gain momentum. Hello and welcome to The World. I'm Tim Stackpool. The move that many young people around the world may make from a local isolated village to a big city doesn't always end as a fairy tale. In fact, that's rarely the case. In Mexico, as the population continues to grow, it forces many, particularly children, to relocate to cities in the search for a better life. But the poverty and sometimes abuse they hope to escape from often ends up following them. Francis Mead has this report.
One of the most famous landmarks of Mexico City is the Golden Angel, who looks down on the more than 20 million inhabitants of this vast urban sprawl. Now the 8th largest in the world. As global population rises, so does the population of the world's cities.
I've been living on the streets for around 13 or 14 years. My name's Marisol. I'm 24 years old. My son's nearly 1, and I live here.
Marisol is one of the many young people who carve a life for themselves in the squalid and often dangerous conditions of the Mexico City streets. Official figures cite some 3,000 people living on the streets, most of them in their teens and 20s. A large number of them have come to the capital city from their villages, driven by lack of jobs, or, like Marisol, by family violence.
I decided to live on my own on the streets when I'd had enough of living with my father. I couldn't stand that he was abusing me, so I left.
She was just 11 years old. Now, Marisol lives in a flimsy shack amidst piles of rubbish with a gang of other kids she calls her family. They survive as best they can, collecting and selling plastic bottles for a meagre 20 cents a day. Life expectancy for these kids is about 30.
You can die from drugs.
The drug is an industrial solvent they call mona. It eventually rots the body and the brain, but it kills hunger and temporarily lifts the kids out of the horror of their daily lives. But, says Marisol, for the girls, even greater dangers await them.
Often men say they'll give us something in exchange for sex.
Edna Madai works for an organization called Fundación Renacimiento, which has a shelter for young people who've been living on the city streets. Prostitution to earn money for food, she says, is common, but the girls also have to earn their place in a gang.
Es una condicionante de repente si una chica quiere permanecer en ese punto.
It's a condition. If a girl wants to be able to join and become part of a group, she has to let some of the boys have sex with her.
And with that is the very real risk of contracting HIV and sexual diseases, as well as unplanned pregnancies. Diego Palacios is the representative of the United Nations Population Fund in Mexico.
So that the kids on the street don't feel abandoned, we have to bring their situation to public attention. The Population Fund is working with the Mexican government to improve the quality of life for young people, and especially for these kids who are the most vulnerable.
And one of these is Marisol. Edna hopes that Marisol will decide to move in and protect both herself and her son from the violent life on the streets.
I don't know what the future holds for my kids, but I've got to get out of all of this, both for my kids and for me. I'm going to do it. I'm going to come through.
That report by Francis Mead. Additionally, a third of women aged between 20 and 24 in developing countries are married before they turn 18. That's according to UNICEF's Anthony Lake. Recently, he reported to the UN General Assembly that worldwide, some 15 million girls become mothers before they're ready. In this report by Jerry Adams, Anthony Lake talks about the changes that are needed, including shifts in traditional practices and behaviours.
When it comes to girls, it most urgently means banning the practice of forced marriage and child marriage once and for all. UNICEF applauds the work of member states that are working to achieve this in their own countries, both legislatively and at the community level. This can change the lives of so many girls, and we hope that many more governments will follow suit as soon as possible.
The more educated a girl is, the more likely she is to do well in life, says the UNICEF executive director. But more than half of the children out of school today are girls. Anthony Lake again.
We know that educated girls are more likely to earn a fair wage as adults, to protect themselves against HIV, to have healthier children, and to send those children to school. But still, more than half of the children out of school today are girls, a statistic that rises sharply at the secondary school level. Uneducated girls are more vulnerable to sexual violence and exploitation, and they are also more likely to be forced into marriage before the onset of adulthood. If trends hold true over the next decade, 100 million girls will be married as children.
Child marriages are a violation of a child's human rights, according to UNICEF. Its recent report on child brides says married children are generally isolated, removed from immediate families, taken out of school, and denied interaction with their peers and communities. Anthony Lake says the future should hold more for these girls and for other disadvantaged children, those who are poor, those with disabilities, or those living in isolated places. Mr. Lake suggests investing in the social sector.
Investing in the social sector, education, health, protection, is vital to both the long-term growth and the future strength of societies. In fact, no society has ever become or remained strong without such investment.
UNICEF's Anthony Lake there, addressing the UN's General Assembly. On the subject of gender, recently the Australian government has approved legislation that allows Australians to choose the gender they wish to be identified as, beyond simply male or female. It actually allows Australians who do not wish to identify themselves as either male or female, or who are transgender or intersex, to choose how they're identified on their passports. Richard Radcliffe is with the Human Rights Office in New York.
It's an interesting issue and one that's often overlooked, but it affects a relatively small but nevertheless significant number of people who feel themselves either to be neither male nor female. They may have been born with a condition known as intersex, which means that physically their physical characteristics are ambiguous and their gender is not easily established. Or they may be transgender. They may have been born with a male body but feel themselves to be inherently female, or vice versa. And these people have really been caught in legal limbo where they haven't been able to obtain official identity documents like a passport that properly reflect the way they express themselves in terms of their gender. And that creates all sorts of practical problems every time they try to apply for a job, or if they're applying for bank credit, or if they're trying to travel, buy an airline ticket, go through an airport. They encounter many, many practical barriers to the way they live their lives. The Australian decision means that they can very easily obtain a passport that reflects their preferred gender, male or female, or for those that want to identify as neither, they can now apply for a passport as indeterminate gender, X.
There must be a huge number of people who are affected by this problem. Is that the reason why the Australian government decided to take this action?
Yes, it didn't cost them very much simply to introduce a third gender on the passport application. In addition, though, there are two things that are significant about it. One is that people can choose now an indeterminate gender if they wish to, if they feel that properly reflects their own gender expression. But it also means it makes it much easier for transgender people who have transitioned from having been born biologically of one gender and are now living their lives as another gender. They can much more easily obtain a passport reflecting their new gender. Previously, and in many countries still today, they have to go through surgery or hormonal treatment, be sterilized, maybe even mandatory divorce if they happen to be married. Very onerous conditions which really make it very difficult for people to obtain proper official identity documents. The Australian decision makes that much easier as well.
Now, is Australia the only country to have done this?
No, in fact, it's quite new that countries are beginning to recognize that this is a problem, and also beginning to recognize that this is not just a policy challenge, but a human rights problem, because the people who are affected, they are facing these practical problems that prevent them getting healthcare, getting employment, getting into education. It's creating all sorts of barriers which prevent them from enjoying their human rights on an equal footing with everyone else.
So how does this work in Australia? Do you merely decide your gender and write that on a form without requiring any particular medical proof?
Well, more or less. They do require you to have a doctor's letter, essentially supporting your gender choice. Unfortunately, I think in the wider community, perhaps misunderstand this issue and think that it's all about transsexuals who want to go through gender reassignment surgery. Well, sometimes it is, but sometimes it just isn't. The fact is that there are many people whose biological gender, the gender in their body, doesn't match the gender that they feel in themselves, in their brains and in their hearts. And they don't need to go through expensive, dangerous surgery, which may be prohibitively expensive, in fact, in many cases, in order to live their lives fully as the other gender.
Charles Radcliffe of the Human Rights Office in New York, talking about the new situation in Australia where more than the traditional male or female genders are now officially recognised. The continued lack of jobs worldwide could spark more social unrest in many countries. That's according to a new study released on Monday by the International Labour Organization. According to the ILO, the global economy is on the verge of a new and deeper jobs recession, and that will further delay the global economic recovery. This grim analysis comes as 20 of the world's leading economies met during the week at the G20 summit. Jocelyn Sambira reports.
80 million jobs are needed over the next 2 years in order to return to pre-crisis employment rates, the ILO says in its new report on the global job market. However, because of a new slowdown in growth, the world economy will likely create only half of the jobs needed. Raymond Torres is the head of ILO's Research Institute.
The economic slowdown, according to our predictions, is having a very significant labor market effect already, and if nothing is done, it will have an even bigger effect on the labor market. Already, employment growth has slowed down in 2/3 in advanced economies for which we have information, and in half the emerging and developing countries for which we have information.
Torres gives 3 main reasons to explain the speed at which the recent downturn is affecting the job market. One of them is the scaling down of government-backed labor and social programs that have in the past helped cushion the effects of the crisis on employment. He also points to the lack of a global response, like the one negotiated in 2009 during a meeting of the world's 20 leading economies, otherwise known as the G20, which is not the case this time, Torres adds.
In this present situation, countries are very much acting in isolation, and so they have a tendency, countries and enterprises, to react in a competitiveness fashion, which means often downscaling staff levels as a response to the economic weakening.
Meanwhile, there's growing anger and discontent over the lack of jobs. The perception is that the global burden is not shared equally, says Raymond Torres, and this could stir more social unrest.
We estimate that 40% of the countries for which we have information are facing the risk of increased social unrest. Confidence in governments is also declining, and more generally, there's a pervasive sense in society that not enough is being done vis-à-vis jobs and vis-à-vis inequalities in the present situation.
200 million people worldwide are without a job. Global unemployment is at its highest point ever. So for the first time in the history of the G20, a social dimension will be included in the agenda.
Jocelyn Sambira reporting. To Africa now, and hundreds of people from Sudan's Blue Nile state are fleeing to Ethiopia as aerial bombings continue. The Sudanese army has been fighting rebels in South Kordofan since June. In the past week, nearly 2,000 Sudanese refugees, mostly women and children, arrived in Kumuk in western Ethiopia. Many of them have reported assaults by Antonov aeroplanes in areas between Kumuk and Blue Nile's capital. Armed militia on the Sudanese side of the Kumuk border have also reportedly warned people to leave, possibly in preparation for a ground offensive. Aditya Mehta spoke to Andrei Mejicic, who is managing the influx of refugees.
The violence that erupted in the Blue Nile state at the beginning of September has so far displaced more than 28,000 people. In the last 4 days, we have counted another 2,000 Sudanese refugees who have arrived in western Ethiopia. amid the tightening security at the border area of Kurmuk. The people arriving from the Blue Nile State are telling us that they basically fled the fighting, the bombings, out of fear. They come from the villages and towns such as Bau, Sali, and Induro. These are located between the Kurmuk town and the capital of the Blue Nile State called Damazin. There are also reports that the armed militia on the Sudanese side of the Kurmuk border have warned the community to leave the area, which is possibly in preparation for a ground offensive.
Many of these refugees are heading for the Tongo camp. Is this camp big enough to house the influx of refugees? Clearly more will be arriving in the days ahead. Also, what's UNHCR doing to help them?
This is the second camp which we opened at the beginning of October. The new camp, which is located in the town of Congo, is about 200 kilometers southeast of the main border point entering the one I mentioned, Kurmuk. There is another camp already in that area, which is called Sharkole, and at the moment these camps are coping with the numbers of the refugees arriving from the Blue Nile State. The planned capacity of the Tongo camp is some 7,000 refugees, and we are with the regional authorities. We are certainly investigating the feasibility of additional campsites should that be needed. We have UNHCR staff at the border point. We also are running the camps and where people are receiving the medical assistance, food, water, sanitation, shelter, etc.
How is Ethiopia coping with this influx of refugees that you speak about, considering it's also receiving people from Somalia?
Ethiopian authorities have been working with us very closely on the expansion of the existing camp in Sharkole and also on the expansion of Tongo camp and looking at the feasibility of opening additional sites. Ethiopia has been receiving all these refugees, but this is in addition to already 174,000 Somali refugees who have been in the country for some years. But this year alone, Ethiopia received between January and October another 90,000 Somalis. We have appealed for the funding for the Blue Nile State emergency for $10 million. However, so far we have received only some 5%, in other words, some $500,000.
Andrea Mecic in Ethiopia, ending that report by Aditya Mehta. It might be interesting to note that of the more than 500,000 people worldwide who die violently each year, only a fraction of that number are killed in conflict such as war or as a result of terrorism. Many of the people who make up the statistic are murdered in criminal gang or drug wars, as well as gender-based or interpersonal violence. This information comes in a report, the second edition of the Global Burden of Armed Violence, released in Geneva on Thursday. Derek Mbatha reports.
The report says that about 55,000 people are killed in war each year, which is far less than the more than 390,000 people murdered outside of armed conflict. Professor Keith Krause, the program director of the Small Arms Survey, an independent research project based in Geneva, explains how the figures are arrived at.
We take an integrated approach to armed violence. We count victims who are killed in large and small wars, in intercommunal or collective political violence, in struggles between criminal gangs or drug gangs, victims of purely economically motivated violence, and of course interpersonal and gender-based violence as well.
But the lines between the different forms of violence are increasingly blurred, says Professor Krause.
Some clear examples of this include the widespread gang violence in places such as Mexico and Central America, vigilante violence in post-election Kenya a few years back, which was both political and criminal, honor killings in Afghanistan carried out by sectarian groups promoting a particular religious agenda. And it's very difficult to come up with neat categories that distinguish conflict from criminal violence.
Armed violence does not only cause pain and suffering to the victims and family members, but it also affects global efforts to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. That's according to Sarah Sekenes of the UN Development Programme.
Children are hindered from attending school, the Millennium Development Goal number 2. Women do not lead healthy lives, Millennium Development Goal 5. Enabling parents to care adequately for their children, Millennium Development Goal 4. And poverty prevails in affected areas, Millennium Development Goal 1. Quite literally sending development into reverse.
The Global Burden of Armed Violence report says high rates of murder are usually found in countries where the rule of law is weak. However, it points out that gang activity, a history of conflict, or a high level of income inequality may lead to high homicide rates, even in societies with strong institutions and rule of law.
To Libya now, and the International Criminal Court is still pursuing two senior fugitives following the liberation of the northern African country. Muammar Gaddafi's son and intelligence chief are still on the run, although the former has been in touch with the ICC. Daniel Dickinson is at the United Nations and he filed this report.
The death of Muammar Gaddafi on October the 20th signalled the end of his 42-year-long totalitarian regime. Libya is now preparing for a new future, but there's still unfinished business to deal with. The former Libyan leader's son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, and his intelligence chief, Abdullah al-Sanusi, are still at large and wanted for crimes against humanity. Briefing the Security Council in New York on Wednesday, Luis Moreno Ocampo, the chief prosecutor of the Hague-based International Criminal Court, said there had been contact with Saif Gaddafi.
We have received questions from individuals linked to Saif al-Islam about the legal conditions attaching to his potential surrender to the court. What will happen to him if he appears before the judges? Could he be sent back to Libya? What will happen if he were to be convicted or acquitted?
It's still not clear where Saif Gaddafi is hiding or whether those individuals who contacted the ICC remain in touch. But Luis Moreno Ocampo says there are still concerns he may flee.
On the other hand, we are also receiving information that a group of mercenaries may be endeavoring to facilitate Saif al-Islam's escape from Libya. We are calling upon the state to do all they can to disrupt any such operation.
Mr. Ocampo spoke to the Security Council on the same day that the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon paid a surprise visit to the Libyan capital Tripoli. He was there to meet the new leadership, the National Transitional Council, or NTC. He briefed the media about that meeting.
In my remarks to the NTC, I said frankly that there is no magic formula, no one size that fits all. But there is at least one common denominator in any solid democracy, that is inclusiveness and dialogue. As Libya moves forward, it is critical that you find a consensus on major issues, that you remain united.
One of the major issues to deal with is the build-up of weapons in the country, as well as new rape allegations, an issue Mr. Ocampo raised at the Security Council in New York.
While it is premature to draw conclusions on specific numbers, the information and evidence indicate at this stage that hundreds of rapes were committed during the conflict.
The new Libyan authorities have pledged to hold elections, but a date has yet to be set. Daniel Dickinson, United Nations.
And before we wrap up for the week, something a little bit lighter, an acknowledgement for two of my Australian countrymen who are currently attempting to be the first to successfully walk to the South Pole and back from the coast of Antarctica. Justin Jones and James Castrician will make the attempt unassisted over the next 3 months, covering 2,200 kilometres, personally heaving 160-kilogram sleds carrying everything they need to survive in perhaps what is the harshest environment on this planet. With the weather finally clearing, they were able to make a start on their journey during the week.
After a 4.5-hour flight, we're down here, it's minus 25 degrees, we are so excited. And a big shout out to all the people that have helped get us down here. James and I are both a bit emotional, and we're just so grateful for everyone that's helped get us down here. So thanks guys, and we look forward to doing your proud down here.
An excited James Castrician there in the Antarctic. The expedition is raising funds for young people with cancer, and the details can be found at our website. And that's the world for this week. If you want to learn more about the program or wish to make a contribution, then please visit us at www.theworldradioshow.com. The World is committed to bringing you stories that affect the people of our planet, either on a mass or individual scale. We hope to do so with balance and integrity. As always, we welcome your comments and your suggestions, so please do keep in touch at www.theworldradioshow.com. The program is produced and compiled by Tim Stackpool, and I certainly look forward to your company next time. Bye for now.